You know, Joe Biden can't actually fire Lloyd Austin. I mean, he would have to be in charge to be able to do it, number one. But number two, this is an administration that has embraced woke intersectionalism. So you can't fire an incompetent first female black vice president. You sure as heck can't fire the first black secretary of defense. You just can't do it. It would violate the rules of woke intersectionalism. Lloyd Austin is an oppressed minority. Lloyd Austin is actually a victim of systemic racism by virtue of being a black man. He can't escape it despite his success, despite getting where he is. The woke intersectionalists believe that he's oppressed. He is oppressed by Whitey. And who is Whitey? Well, that would be none other than corn pop slayer himself, Joe Biden. Joe Biden can't fire Lloyd Austin. To fire Lloyd Austin would be for the white man upholding a systemically racist system to fire the oppressed minority victim. And what did the oppressed minority victim get away with? Being gone. Y'all, I mean, not to be flippant here, but we're in a series of global crises. You have the situation in Ukraine. You have the situation in Israel. By the way, we launched airstrikes against terrorists in Iraq while the Secretary of Defense was in ICU, incapacitated as far as we know. Who was actually calling the shots? You say the Deputy Secretary of Defense. She was on vacation in Puerto Rico and had no idea he was in ICU. I want to talk to you Democrats for just a minute here. In all seriousness, to those of you on the left, to those of you who are Democrats, you know darn well it would be unacceptable if a Republican administration did this. Take Trump out of the equation. If this happened under the Bush administration, the Reagan administration, doesn't matter. You know it would be unacceptable. The fact that Democrats will circle the wagons, you can't really blame Republicans for being able to circle the wagons around all the Trump nonsense when this is nonsense and you're circling the wagons around it. You're defending this. Joe Biden is giving this a pass. There must be consequences for the Secretary of Defense at a time of multiple global crises and military action by the United States being in intensive care without the knowledge of the President of the United States or even his number two, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Congress was not notified. The National Security Council was not notified. The Secretary of State was not notified. The President, the Vice President, not notified. Congressional leaders not notified. The Joint Chiefs not notified. The Deputy Secretary of Defense not notified. You can't excuse this, and yet so many Democrats are willing to, including the President of the United States. You can't then demand Republicans hold their side accountable for things when you're not willing. This is basic. This is constitutional structure 101. The Secretary of Defense reports to the President, is in the chain of command, is in the succession leadership chain of the United States, and disappears for a week without telling his bosses. But there's something more striking here as well. He's gone for a week. He's gone for a week. How is the National Security Council, Jake Sullivan, how is he and the Secretary of State and the Attorney General and the SecDef not meeting regularly? How are they not meeting regularly? By the way, this wasn't over Christmas. People were back at work by the 2nd and the 3rd. Wasn't a holiday period. It was rev back up to work period. This is really one of the I guess biggest red flags for me is that the Secretaries of Defense and State, Attorney General, and the National Security Council leadership aren't regularly meeting at a time of crisis in the Middle East. Who exactly is in charge? Is it Obama? Who's calling the shots? Who authorized military action in the Middle East? And what chain of command did it go through? Because it wasn't the Secretary of Defense. He was in intensive care. There are a whole lot of questions here. The biggest issue here, my buddy Dan McLaughlin, who writes at National Review, pointed this out. This is government by inertia. We're going through the government motions, the motions that always go through on a regular basis. The bureaucracy is sustaining us during this crisis period. That's not a healthy sign. The Democrats like to talk about democracy. It's not a healthy sign for our republic, for a democracy, when it's the bureaucrats going through the motions when the Secretary of Defense is incapacitated in ICU and nobody, including the President of the United States, his direct report, knows. Now, I'm sorry to those of you who you want to defend this and you make excuses for this, but if you're willing to defend this and he's not fired for this, you really need to shut up about Republicans defending things you don't like. Because this really does go to the very basic structure of our government. He really is a direct report. We are unquestionably in a time of global crisis. We launched military strikes on Iranian terror outlets and militias in Iraq last week, and he was incapacitated out of the office. And his deputy secretary of defense, who had to be the one who authorized it, was on vacation in Puerto Rico and had no idea he was incapacitated in intensive care. You just can't blame Republicans for derelictions of duty when you're willing to turn a blind eye to this. The President of the United States can lecture all of us on Donald Trump and the horrors in store for us if he's restored to office, and the Electoral College problems and the threats to democracy and the threats to the republic, but it means nothing if he's not willing to hold his own people accountable for things like this. We launched military action, and the SecDef, unknown to anyone, was in ICU. That's a really big deal. So you can spare me the lectures on the outrages of the Trump administration and what might be by a second Trump administration when you guys claim to be the adults in the room and your SecDef does this and you don't even know about it. And the fact that this is a very loud admission. And this is, again, the most notable part of this to me. It's a very loud admission that the National Security Council lead, the SecDef, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General are not regularly meeting at a time of global crisis. How are they not talking to each other on a very regular basis? If they were, they would have known he was in the ICU, and they clearly weren't talking regularly. So is Jake Sullivan in charge of everything? Are they just bypassing the cabinet positions? Because in our constitutional system, you're not supposed to do that. So spare me your constitutional outrage and your lectures, Democrats, if you can't hold the Secretary of Defense accountable. Was he undergoing transition surgery? He should be transitioned out of a job for this for sure. And that Democrats have circled the wagons around him, it just goes to show you how insincere they are when they lecture Republicans about circling the wagons around Donald Trump. You can't even hold your Secretary of Defense accountable for doing what he did. If it was any member of the military who did that, they would be in trouble. He used to be a member of the military. So spare me your lectures on the behavior of the Republicans when in the middle of global crises and war in the Middle East, where we're launching military actions, the Secretary of Defense or the President of the United States disappears for a week without telling the President, and the President says he's got the guy's back and has no intention of firing him. Those aren't adults in the room. Those are clowns.
Want to be on the show?